Hey, what's up everybody? So it's time to talk about supports in Guild Wars 2. I think they need a little bit of help. Look, this video is going to come across a little ranty, I know, but it's all in good faith. I of course love this game, but I think it's important to call out where it falls short, so that ultimately we get a better game as a result. There's been a lot of changes to the game recently. A lot of balance patches that have been good, some bad, some straight up catastrophic, but I'd say that the dust has settled now and we're all a little bit more content with the state of the game at the moment. In fact, I'm really enjoying basically every class right now. I think they all have incredibly viable and interesting builds. They're in general relatively well balanced, Firebrand and Mechanist notwithstanding. Specifically, there's been a lot of new support builds seeing play, which is awesome, don't get me wrong, but I feel like there's this larger design issue regarding support builds feeling a little spammy. So I thought I'd just share my thoughts on the whole situation and try to bring a bit more visibility to this issue. We can start a conversation and hopefully ArenaNet is listening. So real quick, I just want to clarify what is a support. A support in Guild Wars 2 is basically any build that gives important boons alongside their healing or DPS role. Specifically the Alacrity and Quickness boons, because they're so crucial to gameplay. These builds, unlike pure DPS builds, often have to trade off some of their DPS or even healing sometimes in order to give these boons. Hence, they fall into the support category. So let's talk about ArenaNet's current design philosophy. Bring the player, not the profession. Granted, this might change in the future. They've got some sort of design manifesto coming up that'll be able to clarify ArenaNet's stance on where they want the game to go in terms of combat and class design. But at the moment, they want you to be able to jump into a squad on your main class and be able to essentially fill any role with a combination of your traits, specialization, weapon, and utilities. They don't want you to have to swap class just to fill any given role. And I think on balance, this is a great philosophy. Not everyone wants to multi-class. Not everyone has the time. Maybe they just enjoy the fantasy of their main class. At the moment, pretty much every class has some sort of support or support adjacent build, which is really great, brings a lot of diversity. Except I kind of find this diversity is being a little minimized by the design of these support builds, and we're sort of leading into a bit of class homogenization. Now, there seems to be this general idea that class homogenization in Guild Wars 2 is happening because of the removal of unique class traits and class buffs. Things like banners or spirits. They used to give unique stacking buffs to the party, and so they were essentially crucial in every party composition because it's just extra damage. Now, I absolutely disagree that this has anything to do with class homogenization. I think this is a straw man response and not at all where the core issues actually lie. Class identity to me also doesn't really have anything to do with boon access. Was it kind of cool that back in the day, Guardians were the only ones with access to Aegis? Sure, it's kind of neat for the fantasy, but it's also very unhealthy for the game. Chronomancers used to be the only ones that giving quickness and alacrity. That is horribly unbalanced and not at all great for the game long term. After all, a lot of encounters in the game have been designed around these boons, and any encounters in the future will also be designed around access to these boons. Now, thankfully, ArenaNet have taken steps to ensure more classes have access to these boons, which has given lesser used support specs like Tempest or Herald a lot more value because now they can bring things like Alacrity and Quickness. But where this really becomes an issue, in my opinion, is when it starts to impact class playstyle. This, to me, is the core of class identity, how a class plays. And this is where ArenaNet have kind of started to bungle the implementation of these recent changes and where I feel I need to raise my concerns. So, for example, right now, I've been playing a lot of Herald. This is really a favorite of mine right now. I really enjoy all the boons that this spec provides. What I am not a huge fan of, though, is how ArenaNet have implemented this application of quickness. So they basically grabbed a trait and slapped on quickness. You now apply quickness when you consume a facet. So facets are basically this skill type where you can hit it once and it'll constantly pulse out boons around you, but you can also use them again to consume them and give you some sort of bonus utility or effect before they go on cooldown. And now consuming those also gives you quickness. So that sounds okay on paper, but the duration of quickness is so short on these. Like, I'm talking like 3 to 4 seconds. And these are skills on 20-second cooldowns. So to realistically maintain 100% uptime, which is the goal, you need to spam all of those facets off cooldown as soon as they're up. This sucks because they really all have unique utility. Things like stun breaks or bonus damage for a short period or converting all incoming damage into healing. But you don't care about any of that because they have been completely reduced to quickness buttons that you spam off cooldown. Now, granted, you can give yourself more boon duration so that you've got a little bit of extra leeway, but even if you do that, inevitably, you're gonna have to spam consume all of them to stack up enough quickness again. And maybe that's the trade-off. Maybe if you want to use these situationally, you're gonna need to get some more boon duration. I get that, but I don't think it's particularly good design. There will always be an optimized build for every extra point of concentration that you give yourself. That is stats that could have gone into extra damage. And naturally, while providing these boons, you also want to be doing the maximum amount of damage you can, because that also helps out the team by killing the boss quicker. You're always going to be incentivized to want to maximize the amount of damage you can do while providing these boons. There's no getting away from it. So naturally, the path will always lead to you squeezing out the most amount of damage you can while spamming these buttons as soon as they're up to just reach 100% uptime. Now, if this playstyle of spamming utilities sounds familiar, it's because this is also how almost every other boon support spec in the game plays. Things like Quickness Scrapper, Alacrity Spectre, Chronomancer, Alacrity Druid. Basically, all of these builds, the most optimized way to play them is to pick the trait that grants you quickness and alacrity on a certain utility type and fill up your bar with that utility type. Funnily enough, the only specs that don't follow this kind of model is Firebrand and Mechanist. It's why they're so up there, why they're so powerful, because they have so much flexibility. They are the way that Guild Wars 2 is meant to be played. You pick a trait that lets you provide these boons, and then you only need to slot in like 1 or 2 utilities that help you provide these boons. They have long enough duration that the rest of your skills can be pure situational utility instead of being these boon buttons that you have to use off cooldown. I should mention as well that spamming these utilities feels even worse on some classes than others. Thankfully, Herald, all those consumes are basically instant casts. So you apply those boons as soon as you hit the button. But on things like Spectre and Druid, these have really small cast times, and it just makes them feel incredibly clunky to use. You constantly have to break from doing any DPS so that you can cast all these skills that take forever, and in the end, you just get your boons. You're not even using them for anything important or using them for a certain situation. You're just breaking the flow of combat to provide this boon and give your team 100% uptime. It feels especially bad on high ping. And yeah, the duration on these buttons is just not high enough to support this kind of playstyle. On Revenant, you can't really play an effective heal build because you need to swap to your other stance to provide healing, but they don't stay in there for long because you need to go back to Glint where you can provide your quickness. Now, I think massively buffing the duration of these boons would kind of help. But I think a good solution that already has a precedent is sharing the upkeep of these boons through a combination of your utilities, traits, and weapon skills. For example, on paper, I really like the way that Quickness on Warrior functions. You can take multiple banners for easy coverage and use those off cooldown, or you can take less of them and use the Martial Cadence trait to give quickness on burst skills. And you can also use the Warhorn in your offhand to provide even more quickness. That is a pretty good balance. It incorporates all parts of the Warrior's Toolkit, your utility, your class mechanic, and a weapon. But in practice, the duration on Martial Cadence and on Warhorn isn't long enough to support this kind of build, so this unique combination just does not justify the cost. In Warrior's case, you only end up having to run like 2 banners, which is great, but again, they're relegated to being boon buttons that you press off cooldown rather than using them for their actual utility. There's no synergy across the class's kit. It's all just slapped onto the banners. In fact, anytime Alacrity or Quickness is slapped onto a utility type, it almost always completely overrides the entire purpose of that skill, and I think that's just such a shame. Think about how particularly awful this feels on builds like Spectre, Scrapper, or Herald. where there's no leeway at all to swap out utilities or use them situationally. Every single one of those skills on your utility bar, their primary function is to just provide that boon. Doesn't feel great, and again, it doesn't properly utilize the deep buildcraft and combat mechanics that Guild Wars 2 excels at. Something that could also help is more emphasis on boon extension. Things like Moa Stance on Soul Beast and Warhorn on Tempest, they can extend boons. So if we're just spitballing, you can have more classes where you initially provide the boon with 1 or 2 skills, and then you work on extending it through a weapon skill or another type of utility or a class mechanic. You basically try to extend the duration on those cooldowns throughout the fight, rather than constantly reapplying them. In general, just spreading the boons across all these class mechanics really gives a proper sense of synergy, as opposed to the very tacked-on feel that a lot of the other supports have at the moment. Lastly, this creates a really high APM playstyle, which I think doesn't really service the accessibility and lowering of the skill floor that they've been trying to go after lately. Like, it's not technically hard to spam utilities off cooldown, but it is pretty draining, and I'm sure those with Carpal Tunnel are avoiding these specs like the plague. Overall, just not a huge fan of the direction that ArenaNet have taken recently with these specs. The lack of flexibility with your utilities, being able to swap things out and adjust your playstyle on the fly, has the consequence of making combat and buildcraft feel really one-dimensional in an otherwise mechanically complex game. You have all these interesting utility skills, weapons, specializations, and traits. But in the end, a lot of these builds get reduced down to pick this trait that gives boons to this utility type. Fill your bar with those utilities and spam them off cooldown. On the bright side, balance patches have been absolutely flowing lately, so hopefully we get some reworks in the near future, and we're going to get a clearer insight on what ArenaNet's goals are for class design and combat with the upcoming design manifesto, whenever that releases. So that's my little ramble on the state of support builds in Guild Wars 2. Feel free to comment below. Would love to hear your thoughts. I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, and this is all a pretty common sentiment, but I hope this at least brings a bit more visibility to this issue. Feel free to stick around for more lukewarm Guild Wars 2 takes, but as always, I'll catch you later.